Hello, beautiful community. Um, yes, right. Probably we should talk about the propaganda item that's been emitted by one of the Telegram channels, whereby you see Santa being intercepted by a surface-to-air missile under the guidance of the Russian Santa, who is Grandpa Frost, with a guitar chord progression in the background that comes from a song from a film called Irony of Fate from the 1970s. That is the most definitive and sort of evocative shared movie experience I can think of on the Soviet space, because everybody watched it around the turn of the new year. It's about these folks who go to the banya, get drunk, and one of them ends up in Leningrad instead of Moscow by accident and doesn't tell the difference. So let's look at a reaction from historian Sergei Radchenko to this clip and then give our own reaction. And I just thought that it's good to shove a microphone into a philosopher's face when something like that happens, because it contains a lot of cultural layers. Not sure if I can unpick them without sounding obscure, but we'll give it a go. First of all, Sergei, the Russians are undergoing a cultural revolution of a kind. Remember how the Chinese cultural revolution made no sense to the outside world. With all the beating of intellectuals, big character posters, the crazy Mao cult, the occasional cannibalism, all of this was madness when looked in at from outside. But it had its own internal logic. Same thing here. This cultural revolution is underpinned by toxic chauvinism and xenophobia, cynicism, nihilism, overt violence, and a kind of masochism. The idea here is to reimagine Russia as the anti-West, and this begins with the murder of Santa. Well, let's just imagine we're having a cup of tea together and talking about this very casually. So let's just throw things at the canvas. Minor points first, right? That's weird to a lot of Russians, that propaganda film, which means that there is still a big gap between the obscurantism and reactionaries of the regime and the Z ecosystem and the majority of the population. The regime knows that that gap is a problem for it, and it wants to do something about that gap, but not too much and not too quickly, the old balance of politicization and depoliticization. We also know that implicature in violence disinhibits, right? When Russian soldiers on behalf of Russians are engaging in unconstructive violence, from which most Russians want to half look away, that has a certain kind of disinhibiting effect. It's a sort of a series of radioactive drips into the cultural fabric that Russia is going to be stuck with for a long time. I suppose a final very minor remark is that when you're getting theatrical expressions of sort of negating or nihilistic violence, they're fictional, always focus on the possibility that it's not necessarily an expression of strength, but an expression of alienation and desperation in the face of a modernity that can no longer accommodate you. And when I say that, I'm not saying something about the triumph of liberalism. Liberalism is not triumphing, it's receding, if anything. So what we're saying here is that we're pointing out the fact that Putin's project can't fit into the world sustainably because it has nothing to offer. And we're saying that without Western triumphalism. Groundwork done, right? So how does it look to, let's say, the depoliticized blob that constitutes sort of 40 to 70% of the population in Russia? It does look weird. One thing that expresses itself in a very dramatic way in the ravings of various ideologues of the Russian path, of the Russian world, like Dugin, is that they can't describe Russia's anti-Western position without using Western resources to articulate it. That's true generally, even at the level of a cafe conversation. It's very difficult to sketch a Russian anti-Western position without that position itself becoming Western because of the resources used to sketch the anti-Western position. There's something self-refuting about Russia's rejection of the West, and of course, there's always revealed a kind of neurotic normative dependence on the West in Russia's Western rejections. But then there's a second side to Russia's rejection of the West, and that's that Russia has imported, and is often the case, dramatically intensified a certain mode of Western conservatism, which might make you feel, well, okay, let's try to deal with this NATO-loving LGBT woke Santa. The problem is that is very transparently an import. And it often comes out in an actual admission on the part of the Russians that they are more Western than the West. And what they're really doing isn't opposing the West, but adopting a Western conservative stance that a degenerate West has ceased to be able to take up. So this weird conservative import and its intensifications, culturally conservative import, puts Russia in a position where it's actually saying that it's anti-Westernism, even to the point of launching an SAM at Santa, is actually about rescuing the West, right, by embodying its values in a way that it no longer can. We got cut off, beautiful community. So I just finally wanted to mention the ideological elements of Putinism, which I think have at least three main buckets. And we'll do a major ideology video on the main channel in 2025, because I haven't yet been satisfied by a treatment of the ideology of Putinism that I've encountered. But I think it has three rough buckets. There's a mystical bucket, it has a fascist bucket, and it has a hyper-neoliberal bucket. And what might come from the mystical bucket toward the Santa being intercepted image is clearly this idea of somehow getting the West in a single swoop and progressing Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. That somehow there are these two facts that matter. A, that to win you've got to start at the back. And B, that you can do it in a single maneuver. That's a very important quasi-mystical cultural myth that actually will play a bit into this, 90-second long propaganda video. The fascist stuff is obvious, right? There's this story about violence as an end in itself. But let's say a word about what I call the hyper-neoliberal element. And that's the idea that nothing that isn't me really fundamentally exists. And so that will also be part of how the depoliticized blob in Russia experiences this image of Santa being intercepted by an SAM. Now, what's that caused by? It's caused by generic global forces, I would argue, largely. It's actually not distinctively Russian, largely. And the forces are economic, but they're also to do with the working out and distortion of various romantic notions of self-realization in the West that leads to a kind of hyper-individualism. It's generic, but then it's also worse in Russia, and so you can't just end there. You have to say why it's got such a particular expression there. And there are going to be two threads of explanation about how this is partly distinctive and partly not. It's partly distinctive because of the calamity of the Soviet experiment, and I won't elaborate on that. But there is also something that is a thread in Russian culture for a couple of centuries and more. That is a kind of propensity to atomistic rebellion that can take self-destructive, self-immolatory forms. It can also take constructive forms, and the political and literary tradition of the 19th century in Russia is a good example. It's a fundamentally anti-authoritarian tradition, actually. But it does play a role as one factor among others of intensifying these global forces that are floating around, and thereby presenting them in a more extreme, not unique, but extreme form in the Russian context, forces to do with the thought that nothing that doesn't touch my interests exists. Has this dance around the propaganda clip been helpful? Let me know. Lots of love.